I was involved with all the miners' strikes from start to finish, and Yunus was as well. So that's raised a lot of bitter, angry, and hurtful memories as well around the mining community. So there's that anger there, and I think we've got to tap into that anger. So I'm going to ask now Yunus Bakhsh to speak to us now. So I'd like to welcome Yunus.
All right, well, it ain't often you get to say that you've waited 30 years to do a meeting. On the day that bastard's been put in the ground is a joyous thing. And as you can see, I didn't have a red coat, but I've got as close as I could to something which was celebratory. And it's also extremely fitting, I think, doing a meeting in Sheffield, because, you know, I look around, there's a lot of people my age, but also a lot of younger people who won't remember the fact that Sheffield was at the centre of the resistance to Thatcher and everything that she stood for. From the steel strike right the way through to the miners' strike, and through the oddly named Socialist Republic of South Yorkshire, which was led by a man called Lumpkins, oddly enough. It was a place which stood up against what Thatcher wanted and what Thatcher stood for. And I think it's therefore absolutely right and proper that we have this meeting here tonight. And you see, the thing is, and you'll have to excuse us, I was at Easington. Easington's a pit village, or ex-pit village, like all villages, ex-pit villages, which was occupied by the police. 4,000 police occupied Easington Colliery. The population of Easington is only 8,000, so you can see the lengths they went to get one scab into the pit, which he employed 3,000 workers. His name was Paul Wilkinson, ever etched in my brain, and they occupied it. And you know when you see these iconic pictures, as I'm sure that people have seen them, of people standing outside the front door with a string vest on and a cup of tea, and outside is the riot police. That's Easington. And they had a celebration today where there was about anything up to about 1,000 people there, and it was a fantastic event. Also buoyed up by the fact that it was £1 a pint, which is like it was in the old days. So fortunately I was driving, so I didn't indulge too much, but the spirit there was incredible, and I'll come on to that later. But driving down, you think of all these things, and like the comrade said, today I've avoided watching the news. I've avoided listening to it, if at all possible, because it turns your stomach, absolutely turns your stomach. And one bit of joy I did have driving down is I was listening to some of the music, and I was listening to one track in particular by Bob Dylan, and it's my favourite track of his. I'm not a great fan of his, but Masters of War. I don't know if people know Masters of War. And there was one verse which I think sums up not just how I feel, but how I think millions of people feel about Thatcher. And don't worry, I'm not going to sing. I'll tell you what the verse is. In the verse, it says, "I hope that you die and your death will come soon, and I'll follow your casket on a pale afternoon, and I'll watch while they lower you into your deathbed, and I'll stand on your grave to ensure that you're dead." And that's how people feel about Thatcher. And how about, at Easington, one of the things was, outside of it, was all these media types asking people, do you not think it's inappropriate to be holding this event on the day that Thatcher dies? I can tell you this, there wasn't one single comment I heard that could possibly be broadcast at any time. Forget the watershed. And people said, well, isn't it inappropriate? I say this, socialists, we're not celebrators of death, right? We're people who want to see better lives for everybody. But there are certain people who are deserving of a death, and a long and painful death. And unfortunately, in Thatcher's case, it wasn't long and it wasn't painful enough a death. Because I'll tell you this as well, do you think she had any compassion at all for the millions of people whose lives she ruined? Do you think she showed any contrition at all about murdering the mining communities, about robbing hard-working men of their dignity, of families, of their future, of children, of hope. Do you think she showed any contrition? Not at all. She revelled in it. I was reminded today of what she said about a young miner called Davy Jones who died on the picket line at Ollerton, and she said he knew what he was doing. He knew what he was doing. I'll tell you what he was doing. He was fighting for his job, and he died for it. No compassion there. No compassion from Thatcher when she removed the death benefits for miners, so they couldn't even bury their family. No compassion there. No compassion for 10 young Irishmen who died a slow and lingering death, demanding political status for their struggle against British occupation. No compassion there. Even when one of them, Bobby Sands, was elected as an MP. No compassion from her. No compassion for the young Argentinian conscripts who died in a needless war over a group of rocks in the South Atlantic. And you know what, I remember when Argentina invaded the Falklands, I was at the NUS conference, and people were saying, the Falklands? Isn't that near Scotland? What, Argentina's invaded a group of rocks near Scotland? What? No compassion from her. She was the most heartless, brutal woman you could imagine. But she did have compassion for some mine. She had compassion for apartheid South Africa and the poor, difficult situation that the white minority faced there in suppressing the black majority. She had compassion for that murdering thug, Augustus Pinochet, who had the blood of thousands on his hands. She had compassion for them, but no compassion for our class. So when people say, inappropriate to celebrate her death, I say, fuck Thatcher. I don't give a toss. She didn't die soon enough, as far as I'm concerned. She blighted my life. You see, one of the reasons I haven't read or looked at any of the news, right, is not simply because it's sickening, because I don't need to be told what Thatcher did. I lived it. I lived it. You see, they say that your 20s are supposed to be your halcyon days. She ruined my 20s because she ensured that every single day of my life, and for millions of other people as well, she waged war on me. Now, there's some things that, oddly enough, I'd like to thank her for. The fact is, and I say it to the young people here, there's nothing like a bit of class struggle to recognise that that is the basis on which society is run. But I tell you what, it was a difficult period, a hard period, a period when it was attack after attack after attack, because that's what her agenda was. And you see, in all the guff, all the crap that's been poured out, there was one little thing which I think was give the game away, if you like, about what Thatcher was about. And that was when David Cameron was giving his eulogy to her in Parliament. And I've got to say, I saw what he had to say. I did read that. I thought it was vile. But I also read what Ed Miliband had to say. And I thought that was even worse. It was even worse because he gave concessions to him. How absurd the idea that Pickford should be run by the state. Removal for what? Oh, how absurd. How absurd that we should have profits made from water. Why didn't he say that? Why didn't he say how absurd it is that we have a privatised rail network? How absurd it is that the rich grow richer while the poor get poorer? Didn't say any of that. But what did Cameron say? He said this about Thatcher. He said, successive governments failed to deal with what was beginning to be called the British disease. Appalling industrial relations, poor productivity and high inflation. Now, if you cut through that and you really say what he meant is this: that what Thatcher came into office to deal with was what was known as the British disease. And again, it might come as a surprise to younger comrades that actually there was a time when the British disease, poor industrial relations, working class power, struggle and combativity of the British workers was seen as something that was a major problem. And it was seen as a disease. The ruling class internationally looked on in Britain and said, you know, the British working class, they're tough, aren't they? They're organised, they're strong, they're combative. You know, younger comrades today, and maybe not so younger comrades, think, oh, wish it was like Greece, or wish it was like Portugal, or wish it was like Spain. Well, at one time, everywhere said, I wish it was like Britain. Because Britain was the only state in Western Europe in which a democratically elected government of a time, Edward Heath's government, was booted out as a result of industrial action. And therefore, Thatcher was part of that group of the Tory right who looked on, because she was part of the Heath government. You know, her role in it was as Thatcher the milk snatcher. You know, I mean, she removed spring. I mean, how pathetic. You know, I mean, I remember when, you know, the milk used to come in and kids used to get milk. And the reason kids got milk is because there were lots of kids, working class kids, who never got milk. And it was actually a means of ensuring a certain degree of nutrition. That bastard removed it. And it didn't cost them anything. It cost them next to nothing because all the milk was surplus. That's maybe ringing out. That's it. I like some people, you know, no, you see, that was what she was after. You see, when they talk about appalling industrial relations, it was the fact that workers' struggle in Britain was at an historic high. That workers had, over a period of number of years, built up strong sectional workplace organisation, were prepared to use their power, and did use their power. It's also the case that when he talks about poor productivity, what that is really shorthand for is to say that basically workers were paid too much and profits were too low. Therefore, workers had to work harder. That's what they meant. And when they talk about inflation, what they meant is wages were going up. So Thatcher's goal, Thatcher's aim, was to put an end to that. Which, you know, as I say, she'd had the experience of the Heath government where they'd singularly failed to do that. See, Edward Heath is looked on now, if people remember him at all, as some kind of, you know, buffoonish character, quite benign really compared to Margaret Thatcher. He was anything but. He was elected on a clear basis that he was going to deal with the unions, he was going to deal with the working class, he was going to ensure that profits went up and wages went down. But he came a cropper. He came a cropper at the hands of the organised working class. And as I said before, what happened is a group of the rank within inside the Tory party decided that, listen, we've got to learn a few lessons. And there's one thing we've got to be clear of here. Never, ever underestimate your opponents. Never. Thatcher wasn't an idiot. She was clever. The people around her were clever. And they devised a strategy. Now, it's not up there yet, but I understand it is going to be. It was called the Ridley Plan. And it's great that we've actually got a copy of the Ridley Plan. I'm not going to go through it. There it is. The Ridley Plan. And the Ridley Plan was basically this. That what Heath had made the mistake of doing was confronting the trade union movement, the workers' movement, all at once. And that what was needed was an approach which took on the unions one by one, starting with the weakest, or the perceived weakest, and building up to deal with the most powerful, which of course was the National Union of Mine Workers. And when Thatcher was elected in '79, obviously on the back of an incredibly unpopular Labour government, they set about implementing that strategy. It was a strategy which was based on a number of other things as well. First of all, that the Tories would allow, through management of the economy, interest rates, effectively unemployment to go through the roof. And it did. I mean, for anybody who was around at that time, I mean, you look at unemployment today, then, I mean, it just, unemployment doubled and then doubled again. Suddenly, it went, you know, suddenly from a situation where most people, yes, there'd been unemployment, but had experienced unemployment at maybe 1 million as being a post-war high, suddenly unemployment was up to 3 million. Factory after factory after factory went to the wall. And combined with that, and that would be used to discipline people, the fear of losing your job. If you went on strike, if you stood up for higher wages, somebody else would want your job, or there'd be no job there at all. That's what was one side of the strategy, the Ridley strategy. The other one was to introduce a series of legal shackles onto the trade unions, reversing the gains that workers had won, you know, by defeating Heath, and start to impose limits on things like get rid of the closed shop, which was the process whereby if you went into a workplace, you had to join a union. There was no ifs and buts. You didn't need to go around recruiting. You either joined the union or you didn't get the job. And that was an immense source of strength for workers, because you knew then you had a 100% union organisation. She got rid of that. Introduced a whole number of other measures. One of the first measures she introduced was to get rid of earnings-related benefits. You see, one of the things that workers won in the 1970s was a simple demand. If you put me on the dole, it's not my fault. So therefore, if I'm on the dole, you're going to pay me more or less the same as I got when I was working. Therefore, there's no point in putting us on the dole. She got rid of that. She introduced a whole series, as I say, of anti-trade union laws, step by step. But that was combined with an understanding by the Tories of the nature of the trade union bureaucracy. You know, sometimes the only two groups of people who really understand the trade union bureaucracy are revolutionary socialists like ourselves and the bosses. Because anybody who has illusions of the trade union bureaucracy, you know, fails to understand them at all. They understand them. They understand, because they spend a lot of time with them actually, they do understand how spineless these people are. But they recognised that actually the trade union bureaucracy, faced with a series of legal shackles, would be faced in the situation of either they stood up and fought the law and broke the law and be condemned as lawbreakers, or alternatively, they would go under. That was part of their strategy. Now, the Ridley Plan introduced the first group of workers they decided to take on, major group of workers, were the steel workers. Now you imagine the steel workers, very militant, actually quite the contrary. Steel workers hadn't been on strike, national strike, since the general strike. Their leadership was notoriously right-wing, a man called Bill Sayers. I mean, Bill Sayers, you know, was the epitome of the trade union right-wing baron. And although there was a rank and file organisation, the Tories thought they'd be able to deal with the steel workers fairly quickly. As it happened, they didn't. The steel workers put up tremendous resistance. I mean, you know, certainly in areas like Sheffield, you know, so you've got Stocksfield and the other plants, where there was rank and file organisation, you know, and there was Real Steel News, which was our publication, but was taken up throughout the union. The workers there, the steel strike ended with a score draw, if you like. They did get a pay increase, but Thatcher then set about basically butchering the steel industry as a reprisal. The next group of workers they took on was the health workers. In 1982, they took on the health workers, decided that they were going to break them. And although, you know, they managed to impose a series of, you know, pay restraints and so on, there was resistance. That was the key, resistance. People did fight back. And the Tories, you know, again, this has to be said, because you get this impression from the media that Thatcher was this unstoppable juggernaut who couldn't, you know, just went on, and she didn't. In 1981, they announced a series of pit closures starting in South Wales. The response of the miners was to walk out on strike, and the strike began to spread beyond South Wales to South Yorkshire and so on. What did Thatcher do? They retreated. Why? Because actually they weren't prepared for that strike. Therefore, it wasn't the case that Thatcher just went on and on, that the Ridley Plan here was implemented like some kind of mechanical clock, you know, it's precise. It wasn't. It was a risk. It was a risky strategy, but it was one that they managed to get away with to some extent. And it was interesting to know that, you know, by 1982, Thatcher was, you know, the most unpopular Prime Minister since records began. And she was saved by two key key events or developments. One, really, was that the right wing of the Labour Party, the Gang of Four, Shirley Williams, Jenkins, and David Owen, and I forget the names of these faceless arseholes who have now vanished into the dustbin of history. But these people set up the Social Democratic Party, which managed to split the anti-Tory vote. And that enabled Thatcher in '83 to win a victory, even though her vote went down. Right? Even though her vote went down, you don't get much of this in the media, do you? The other thing was that General Galtieri and the group of discredited generals who run Argentina, incidentally, General Galtieri was a big mate of General Pinochet, who, of course, we know that Thatcher loved. They decided they were going to invade the Falklands, basically to show up their own regime at home. This enabled Thatcher to wrap herself in the Union Jack, send off the fleet, and as socialist workers pointed out, had the Argentinian army been able to arm its weapons well enough, which they bought from France, by the way, the Exocet missiles, it's likely Britain would have lost that war. It also is the case that Thatcher was helped massively in that war by the role of the Labour Party. I mean, the Labour Party then was led by a man called Michael Foot. Michael Foot was a long-term, long-standing pacifist, a man who supported CND, who went up the old Aldermaston marches, who had a history. And yet Foot got up in Parliament and said, today we stand with you. And there was a minuscule opposition, not like in 2003, there was minuscule opposition to the Falklands War. And I'm proud to say Socialist Worker was absolutely bang at the centre of it. Absolutely bang at the centre of it. Anybody who sees the headlines of our paper at that time, right, where, blood on our hands, it's their war, not ours. We stood out openly, at a much more difficult time, it's going to be said, in terms of an anti-war movement than a feeling than in 2003. And so therefore Thatcher got re-elected in '83 with a sizeable majority, and at that stage they decided it was time to go for the big guns, go for the major unions. Now, interestingly enough, you see, they started it, really, the trial for the Ridley Plan, train and equip a large mobile squad of police, at a place called Warrington. I was there that night. I was hoping Dave Hayes would be here tonight, because I remember Dave Hayes being there when what happened was there was a maverick. He wasn't such a maverick, but he was presented as a maverick, a little man, a little printer, a guy called Eddie Sharp. I think he went to prison. Ooh. Has he not been to prison recently for child pornography or something? I mean, I know this has been filmed, and if he's dead, great. You can't slander somebody who's dead. But I mean, he's been to prison for something. Anyway. The fact is that he decided he was going to take on the National Graphical Association, and it was a gauntlet thrown down at a very powerful union. And the test was that his papers were coming out of a plant at Warrington. I remember going down. People were going down night after night. There were mass pickets. And I remember being down one particular night, the night really. That was the night when Dave Hayes had his boots pulled off him and so on. When I saw for the first time in my experience, really, what the state are capable of, short of opening fire on us. I mean, it was the most horrendous night where we were pushing against the police, mass pickets, thousands of us, and all of a sudden the police lines opened, and I thought, we're through here. The reason they opened is because the riot police were coming through in their thousands with little helmets, little shields, and clubbing everything, including the coppers who were standing in front of them to get to us. And it was a horrendous night. Not a little anecdotal story. I remember after we'd been, absolutely hammered, beaten by these people, there were two young women standing at the side of the road. There was a big line of riot police looking impassively, with their shields and that. And these two young women who were militant supporters, you know, what's now the Socialist Party, who at that time were deeply embedded in the Labour Party. And I remember these two women, and this is one of the things that you remember from that period, going up to these coppers and saying, "Why did you do that? You're workers in uniform." And this copper looked at his mate and just went smack, belted, and just smashed all the side of her face in. That was a trial run for what was to come. And you know, obviously Joe's not here tonight, because I remember Joe from the strike, and you know, I hadn't really prepared a great deal to talk about the strike, and I'm not going to, because there's lots of people who are involved in it. I'm looking around and but you know, it was clear that they had a strategy and they had a plan. They decided to close Cortonwood Colliery outside of the pit review process, knowing that was basically declaring war on the National Union of Mine Workers. And they planned it. They'd looked at the coal stocks, they'd looked at the time of year, they decided that it was time to go for it. They had the preparations, etc. It was all in place. And you know, I remember, you know, the response of the miners was patchy to start with. Some areas worked, some areas didn't. But gradually, through the process, not of a ballot, but of mass picketing, where workers went from pit to pit, talking to each other, the miners' strike was underway. You know, I remember Ian Mitchell, who worked at Rotherham, at Silverwood, saying that they had a mass meeting, and very simply, they went in, there were 2,000 of them. He said the lodge chair got the union banner, pulled it down, and said, "It's war." And that's what it was. And for the next year, it was war. It was war on a scale that nobody had seen in this country, certainly since the general strike. And it was, in many ways, the most marvellous of strikes. I mean, you know, I saw the pictures today, and it moved me so much to look at it. And I saw, you know, men in the 60s crying at the pictures of what we went through. And I say what we went through because our class went through it. Whether or not you worked in the pit or not, you were part of that. It was central to you. And Thatcher and her class waged the most bloody war. They killed a number of miners. A number of miners, not just David Jones, but a number of miners died. They spent more money on breaking the miners than it would have cost to keep every pit open for the next 200 years and giving the coal away for free. Because it wasn't about coal. It was about breaking the National Union of Mine Workers and sending a message to the rest of the working class that if we can break the most powerful section of your class, we can break you. You don't stand a chance. And it wasn't inevitable, by the way. Not at all. Not at all. I mean, you know, you talk about arseholes. David Blunkett is a piece of shit. He is a piece of shit. Because I heard what he said. He said, Arthur Scargill and Galtieri handed Thatcher a victory on a plate. That's an absolutely disgraceful thing to say. Absolutely disgraceful thing to say. I'll tell you, during the strike, there's a number of reasons, things that could have shifted it. First of all, the TUC, instead of organising the solidarity action that they said they were going to, that they voted for, failed to deliver the blacking of coal. You also had a disastrous local leadership in a number of the areas. South Yorkshire was one. Jack Taylor, you know, terrible leadership. Scotland, where you had nationalism, saying keep Ravenscraig open. Mick Maguire, who was in the Communist Party at the time, keep Ravenscraig open. So, you know, we've got to send coal through there. It was a disastrous strategy. You also had, of course, the leadership of the Pit Deputies Union, a man called McNestry. People might not remember him, I remember him. The Pit Deputies voted by 92% for strike action. Had they come out, every single pit would have shut, including the ones that were working in Nottingham, because they couldn't have a pit open without pit deputies. Instead, a deal was cobbled up behind the scenes, and the pit deputies continued to work. There was an opportunity in the summer of '84 when there was a dockers strike, an unofficial dockers strike developed, an attempt to introduce scab labour in Scotland. And again, there was an opportunity there. There were several opportunities, and when you read now the historical transcripts of what the Tories were discussing, they weren't confident. They were worried, seriously worried. But nevertheless, as we know, there's no point in going back over it, the miners would be beaten but not broken, but beaten nevertheless. And that enabled then Thatcher to go for other sections as well. The next group of workers that were up were obviously the printers. Their mate, Rupert Murdoch, and is it no coincidence that his disgusting, filthy press have been the ones that have been whipping it up so much for Thatcher. He went for the print unions at Wapping. And again, paramilitary police, thousands upon thousands upon thousands. But again, they wouldn't have been able to do that had they not had the connivance of sections of the right wing of the trade union bureaucracy, in particular the leadership of the electricians union, a man called Eric Hammond, absolute filthy, dirty scam. And then of course they went for the dockers and they broke the National Dock Labour Scheme. And really by 88, Thatcher was cock-a-hoop. They'd actually been able to see off and beat, at an enormous cost, the best organised and the most combative working class movements in Western Europe. And of course we had the Lawson boom, you know, the tax cuts, the handouts, the privatisations, you know, the council house sell-offs and all the rest of that stuff which went with it. And in a sense, Thatcher became, I think, quite punch-drunk in success. They thought they could do anything. And then they made a big mistake, didn't they? They did exactly what they said they were going to do. They decided to introduce a measure which attacked everybody at the same time. It was called the poll tax. And what an absolute disaster that proved to be for Thatcher. I'll tell you what, I mean, again, and I look around, you know, and I know most people here, probably most people here, you know, remember the poll tax, some people don't. I remember when, you know, we were saying, you don't pay the poll tax and so on, you weren't quite sure what the response was going to be. And I got summons to go to Bladen Magistrates Court for refusal to pay the poll tax. So I got a few copies of Sortier's work. I go down there and I see if there's anybody who wants one. And I went to Bladen Magistrates Court. There were 3,000 people outside. None of whom knew each other, but all of whom, in Gateshead alone, had decided they weren't going to pay. It was fantastic. The magistrate's car turned up to hear the cases, and there were women moving the car, turning the car over. The courts couldn't hold it that day. Of course, that's what happened up and down the country. And 11 million people refused to pay, despite being told so to pay by Neil Kinnock and the Labour Party leadership, who said, pay your poll tax. 11 million people said, we're not paying it. And it became an absolute disaster for the Tories. An incredible disaster. And it led, of course, as we know, to the riot in Trafalgar Square. And ultimately, it led to sections of the Tory party turning against Thatcher and getting rid of her. I mean, this wonderful, wonderful picture. I mean, if there's a picture of Thatcher that you want to remember, it's that one. You know, look at it. You know. I'm sorry for it. I don't normally use foul language in meetings, but there are occasions. I do excuses. Interestingly enough, the same people who today are saying how marvellous she was, how wonderful she was, are the same people who stuck the boot in. The ruling class are nothing if not ruthless against their own if they're not doing what is necessary. And they got rid of her. They dumped her. They give her the elbow. No. I want to really finish with this because there's been a lot of talk about how she's fundamentally changed Britain. Well, in some ways, yes, she has fundamentally changed Britain. You know, I drove here from Newcastle. I drove through County Durham. Not a single pit working. I drove through Yorkshire. How many pits left in Yorkshire? Working? Two working pits left in Yorkshire. 3 nationally. Oh, she had changed society all right in that sense. When once you had people who worked, who had a job, now you've got villages which are just hellholes, where, you know, drug abuse, alcoholism, despair, and unfortunately racism can start to get a hold. That's how she fundamentally changed things. Did she change the fortunes of British capitalism? I don't think so. I mean, it's great. The day they buried it, they announced that unemployment's risen to 2.56 million. It's gone up 70,000. The British economy is still sick. She didn't cure it. She didn't deal with it. But what she did do is she took on and broke a section of our class, one after the other, including the miners, which has affected us to this day. Whether you were born during the miners' strike or after it, or whether you experienced it, it affects you. Why? Because an already timid trade union bureaucracy has become even more supine in its response. Yeah, I know there's been resistance, and that's fantastic. But actually, the immense power of the British working class has never been harnessed in the way that it should be and it could be to take on and beat this government. And this is an incredibly weak government. You know, Cameron isn't strong. He likes to present himself. And the funny thing is, with all this guff about Thatcher, what's happened? Tories have gone down in the polls. They haven't said, you know, people aren't saying, oh yeah, great, fantastic. Actually, quite the contrary. I noticed yesterday an opinion poll showing that British people were more inclined to be sympathetic to people on benefits than workers around the rest of Europe. That most people are against privatisation. Thatcher didn't change that. She didn't change it. People don't, you know, automatically think, oh yeah, it's good that the rich are richer, that the bankers should be able to run things. Not at all. She didn't change that. But she waged war on us. And when Thatcher was asked what's your greatest legacy, she said, New Labour. That's what she said, New Labour. And in that she's absolutely right. Because one of the things about this disgusting, absolute disgusting carnival reaction around Thatcher is that it's meant to tell you and cement the idea in people's heads there is no alternative to what we have. That's all you can ever ask for. I mean, when Miliband went on how absurd it is that we had nationalised Pickfords, you know, and so on, how ridiculous. That's meant to tell us that there is no alternative to privatisation. There's no alternative to neoliberalism. There's no alternative to austerity. That we've all got to pay the price. That's what this is about at the moment. But I'll tell you this. What I saw today in Islington was the real spirit of resistance. What you see in every pit village, in every major city, is people who are so sickened and turned off by this that maybe they don't come out on the streets, but they hate it. They hate it. And they can pour all the honeyed words onto Thatcher, try to play her up as much as possible, but it will never change how people feel. Why? Because it isn't about the ideas in your head, it's about what you experience. Because the attacks are coming thick and fast, aren't they? The attacks have been coming thick and fast, not simply since Thatcher went. When Thatcher went, we had a period, didn't we? Major, finished off the coal industry. Then we had Blair, you know, Tony Blair, who's now telling Labour, don't go too far to the left. Where he thinks that the Labour Party's going to the left is anybody's guess, but you know, this war criminal, you know, has been advising Ed Miliband. And I think, if you like, the legacy of Thatcher is that she was a warrior. She was a warrior for her class. And if there's one thing we can learn from her, one thing, and that is we should have the determination to fight for our class, our interests, the same as she had to fight in the interest of her class. Because it is a class war. Anybody who thinks otherwise is living in clown cuckoo land. Anybody who thinks you can duck out of it, that is an oasis somewhere where you can escape this, is, you know, living in a dream world. Whether you want it or not, the class war comes to you. And you have two alternatives. You either succumb, or you follow the likes of the miners, who said, we will stand up and fight. And remember this, it is always better to stand up and fight than succumb. It's better, isn't it, to die on your feet than live on your knees. Thatcher didn't destroy our class. She broke sections of it, but she didn't win the war. The war's yet to be won. And Cameron and his class are all gathered there today in London. And, I think somebody said, where's the IRA when you need them? All 2,000 of them, sickening, filthy criminals, bloody bankers, crooks, the lot of them. They represent one set of interests. We have to fight for an organisation that represents an entirely different one. We will bury Thatcher's legacy when we build a movement that will bury the system that she fought tooth and nail to defend. In the sense that I think there is a shift, there has been a shift in that, oddly enough, European integration has led to more integration in terms of people understanding that, austerity, we're all in it together. Yeah, our class is all in it together, whether or not you're Greece, or you live in Portugal, or you're Spanish, whatever. There is a common strategy and theme to what the ruling class are doing internationally. Whereas during the period of the 80s, Thatcher was one of the, if you like, she was one of the outriders for the neoliberal attacks on the working class. Her and Ronald Reagan were, if you like, seen as the embodiments of the new breed of rulers who would sort people out, who would reverse all the gains of the post-war period. And, in a sense, what we have now is that being, effectively rolled out across the rest of Europe. I mean, the great thing about Greece, I know that the comrade was mentioning Greece, I mean, the Greek working class are incredibly combative, and they've not suffered, incidentally, the defeat that we suffered. So I think it's very important that we recognise that actually things haven't gone all their way, and that there is, there's always countervailing tendencies to anything that the ruling class want to do. But I want to come on to a number of other things, really. See, I tell you one thing that people do need to understand is the nature of the state. You see, people have been bemoaning the BBC and its coverage. What do you think? What do you think? It's called the British Broadcasting Corporation. And Britain ain't you, and it ain't me, it's them. They own it, they run it, they decide what's on it. Right? Cut its teeth in the general strike. First of all, being used to, as a scab instrument, and will ever since. And it reflects their views. The prevailing ideas are the ideas of the ruling class, and they're disseminated through many means, and one of which is through the BBC. So all this stuff about Ding Dong, the song, and they've fiddled the charts. Heck, really? I'm astonished. I mean, because people remember during the miners' strike, one thing that the BBC did do is they reversed, right, the sequence of pictures from Orgreave, which seemed to show on the media that the miners started chucking bricks and stones at the police, and the police responded. In fact, the Glasgow Media Studies Group revealed that they'd reversed the order of that. So, let's be clear about that. And also, you see, the extent of the state. We now know, don't we, it's been revealed, that the state will go to extraordinary lengths to embed people in opposition groups. I'm looking around here to see if anybody... I think Jim looks at this.
Sat at the back.
Yeah, well, I know, Jim, I know, you didn't buy me a drink. But they go to extraordinary lengths to embed themselves. And they did it with the miners. I mean, people know, don't they, that Arthur Scargill's chauffeur was an MI6 agent. That they had been bugging the NUM headquarters, not at the beginning of the strike, but for years. The state is, when it boils down to it, bodies of armed men to defend the interest of their class against ours. That's what people should learn. The other thing as well, incidentally, that people should learn, and this is something, again, I think people have alluded to, and a comrade here said, You know, class struggle, class war is war. It is a war. It's a fight to the finish. It involves the use of physical force by their side against ours, and in response we do the same. You know, you get some people today, I'm sorry, but people who think that, you know, the class struggle is about what you post on Facebook, you know, about the internet. Oh no, it's not. The class struggle is about organising our side to impose our will as a collective class against their class. And that does require that we take on the power of the state. It does require that. And in order to do that, you can't do it if you're a minority. You need to organise the majority. And this is what some people haven't learned. They still get people who say, you know, join the Labour Party. You know, if we can shift the Labour Party to the left, push it to the left. Come on. You know, I'm sorry, but the Labour Party is not an instrument to bring about the socialist transformation of society. It's a prison for socialists. It's a graveyard for socialists. And anybody who says otherwise does not understand the history of the Labour Party. And certainly does not recognise what the Labour Party's role was during the strike. There were many Labour Party members involved in the strike. There were also many Labour Party members who were against the strike. And I'm talking about the miners' strike. Kinnock, the leader of the Labour Party, the man who represented a mining constituency in South Wales, managed to get onto the picket line on the last day of the strike. That's what he managed to do. And his consistent undermining of the strike, his condemning of the violence of the pickets, was absolutely central to part of their strategy to demonise and isolate the miners during that strike. So we've got to be absolutely clear about that. But there's also another problem, and you know, I mentioned the Labour Party. They're all of the trade union bureaucracy. You see, in 1972 and 1974, the miners beat the Tories. And central to that victory wasn't the leadership of the National Union of Mine Workers. Joe Gormley, right, was in the pockets of the bosses. He was bribed. He was paid in the pockets of the bosses. And I think subsequently people revealed he was in all probability being paid by the state. That's the recent revelations about him. But despite that, the miners won. Why? Because the miners relied on rank and file organisation from below. That was lost by 84. Why? Because actually, even somebody as fantastic a trade union leader as Arthur Scargill was, and I don't think anybody should ever denigrate his role during the strike, right? Should never do that. Whatever disagreements we have with Scargill, and I'll finish with something that Scargill said, you know, we must recognise that he stood 100% absolutely rock solid throughout that strike. But his problem was, his idea was that you build your strength from above and not from below. So the rank and file networks, the Doncaster panel, the Barnsley panel, the groups of militants who could organise independently of the trade union leadership in the 1972 and 74 strike, in particular in 72, were lost when they looked instead to actually take control of the NUM from above. And what it meant was that Jack Taylor, the right-wing leader of the NUM in Yorkshire, continually sent pickets from Yorkshire on hopeless expeditions into Nottinghamshire rather than organise people to go to Orgreave. People mention Orgreave. You know, I've mentioned it. The fact is, there were 70,000 Yorkshire miners. We could have beaten the police at Orgreave. We could have. And there's an iconic picture of one miner holding up a socialist worker placard saying, "Turn Orgreave into Saltley." We didn't have the strength to be able to deliver that, but we knew what was needed. That was the key. And why did we know what was needed? Because we are an organisation that bases itself on belief that others will do it for us. We base ourselves on the fundamental premise that only the working class, organised for itself, can actually fundamentally change society. You see, I don't want to talk too much about Thatcher. She's going to be dust. She's going to be a footnote in history. I want to talk about what we're going to do to destroy her legacy. Because it's fantastic people are organising around the bedroom tax. We are beginning to see the shoots of recovery. When a comrade says, and he's right, that manufacturing industry, the old battalions, the battalions I used to look to when I was a youngster, the miners, the dockers, the engineers, the shipyard workers, most of those industries have been destroyed. What hasn't changed is the fact that capitalism still needs the labour of workers in order for it to function. And the sons and the daughters of the miners now work in the call centres, now work in the supermarkets. And supermarkets these days ain't your corner shop, right? These are big operations. And we have to rebuild our organisation. The history of the British working class is that the union organisation that Thatcher set out to destroy didn't come from nowhere. It took years to build up. Years to build up. Our class constantly reorganises itself, reinvents itself. And we have to be part and parcel of that. But to inject the memory of past defeats in order to ensure that the future is one of victories. And that means we learn the lessons. And the lessons are, we need more revolutionaries. We ain't ever going to get rid of this system unless we have a revolution. They're never going to give out to us, ever, unless we force them to. They'll constantly take whatever we do win back, unless we fight and fight and fight. So it is a war, it's a battle. And Thatcher, of course, knew that, and so do we. Therefore, it's very important that people are involved in every single struggle that occurs. That we remember the past, we remember those things. We take the bitterness, and that bitterness exists, that anger, and channel it in a direction that people can come together. You see, unfortunately, and a number of comrades have mentioned it, you know, in some of the pit villages, and I'm sure that's the same, it's the same in South Yorkshire, you know, fascists are starting to get a hearing, or have had a hearing. Even if it's no immigrants, or black people, it's them. They can turn despair in on itself, work is in on it. The only antidote to that is to have an organisation that offers not despair but hope. And that's us. And I'm proud to say it's us. You know, I'm proud to say that Socialist Worker has been at the forefront of celebrating the death of Thatcher. And the ruling class know it. They acknowledge that. And I'm proud of our paper saying rejoice. But the only people who said it are the people that are pussyfooting around. We're not. Because we rejoice in the death of somebody who's fought for their class against ours. And I want to finish really by saying this. You see, you know, any of us, and I've talked about the miners' strike because it's the most important single strike that any of us have ever been involved in. A seminal moment, a seminal strike, a strike which determined the future generations. They hope that we will not be able to recover. We've got another thing coming. We are recovering. We will recover. Our class will rebuild, but only on the basis that we learn the lessons of the past and that we start to organise on an entirely different way to those who think that it comes from above, or relying on trade union leaders, or relying on the Labour Party. We need revolutionaries, as I said before. But I want to finish with this, really. And it's something that I've always wanted to mention. I remember going to perhaps the most inspiring meeting I've ever been to in my life. I went to a meeting in the Newcastle City Hall during the miners' strike. And it was absolutely full to the gunnels. And a number of people getting up and speaking, and Scargill spoke. And, you know, as I said before, though I might have fundamental disagreements with Scargill, what he said that night is something that should inspire us all. And he said, you know, he says, we may be poor today, but we won't always be poor. They will be scabs until the end of time. And he finished by saying, that the great only appear great because we are on our knees. Let us rise, and that's what our legacy should be, and that's what we want to put on Thatcher's gravestone.